What's up? How you doing? I am David Long. What you're about to see is an edited clip from a talk I had on the Consciousness Matters YouTube channel. After you watch this, go check out that full talk and the rest of the videos on his channel.
In the corner for the emergence of consciousness, we have David Long from the YouTube channel I Am David Long. In the corner for consciousness being fundamental, we have myself from Consciousness Matters.
Integral theory can be really interesting. Like on the other side of deconstructing that idea of the tetra arising of the quadrants, I came up with this idea called nested quadratic holarchies, which are basically different reprioritizing of the nesting of those quadrants within each other in relation to different philosophical projects. So for example, I'm saying that when it comes to epistemology, the upper left quadrant is primary. Personal interiority is primary. We have to start with that. In terms of morality, the lower left quadrant, or like the greater good, is primary. And everything else, all the other quadrants are subservient to that. And I would say when it comes to ontology or cosmology, that as an emergentist, I think the upper right quadrant is primary. So it's like the quadrants relate to each other differently depending on what the project is. And
So when you say upper right, we're talking about an objective view there, the exterior rather than the interior view, yeah?
A single, like you would say, the universe is a thing, equals mc squared. So energy, something like that. Like there's a primary fundamental thingness to the universe or something like that. It's technically like a realism or materialism or something like this. Although the reason that emergentist integralists will usually avoid saying that they're materialists is because usually integralists will speak in derogatory terms about reductionist materialism. And it's more considered to be like a modern rational reductionism, where they want to say the only things that exist are things that you can grasp in your hands. Like only stuff exists. That's what we call like exterior reductionism. So as an integralist, I include all these different factors. I'm not trying to say that consciousness isn't real, or that values aren't real, that love isn't real. Of course, all that stuff is real. Yeah, so
That's great.
That would be an important distinction. Yeah. This is also why I was saying that there's not just one type of materialism or one type of idealism, right? Because I would argue with that materialist and tell him that his position was foolish and reductionist, and that even his one way of talking about things is limited. It's easier to know something about the emergence of something on Earth that we can start to maybe try to measure versus claims about what the ultimate nature of reality is. That's a little bit harder to make claims about. And I would also like to potentially plant a flag in this idea that if I, let's say, suck at making a case for emergentism to people's liking or whatever, that is a separate thing from whether something like idealism stands on its own as a theory, right? So it can't just be like this versus that or something like that. And it's like if we destroy another person's view, then that means our view stands. This is kind of a move I feel like a lot of idealists are doing. Instead of making a case for their view, they just try to talk about and poke holes in materialism and be like, see, that's stupid. And then they act like their view is the natural alternative that's just a given or something like that. And I feel like any cosmological position needs to be reasonably established.
That's interesting. It's nice to hear you sort of describe it from your point of view as well. I appreciate that. So I feel like what you're asking me to do here is to accept that there isn't a dichotomy. There isn't a valid dichotomy. Phenomenal consciousness, it can emerge, or it could have been here all along, or it could be something else. Right, so it's not just one or the other. There isn't like two sides to a coin here. There's a third option. And I suppose what I'm trying to figure out is what that third option could be.
Right, or even if there's not a third option, for either case to be said to be solid, it has to stand on its own feet. That knocking down the other position doesn't make your position stand, whoever may be doing that. You know what I mean? So if I want emergentism to be considered a valid theory, I have to do a good job to support that. And no amount of talking trash about idealism is going to get me there. And likewise,
Okay.
I can knock down idealism all day long and I can show them potentially that it doesn't stand, right? And like, even if I suck at representing emergentism, I could still show that idealism doesn't stand and vice versa, right? So it's like an idea has to stand on its own, basically, is what I'm saying.
I think I sort of see what you're saying, but I'm not sure I completely agree with that. I think I can see where you're coming from, and I think that were it not something that we could consider a dichotomy, you'd be absolutely right. So if it wasn't something where the light bulb can be on or off, then I think that if the case for it being off was really rubbish, then it is likely to be on. But if the case, do you see what I'm getting at here? So I think that the difference in our position at the moment is
there are multiple positions on this thing. It's not just idealism versus materialism. There's panpsychist. There's like
that's very
several
true,
different
right?
ways
So
to be idealist or materialist, and so if you want to establish what you think, what kind of materialist or idealist you are, you would have to make a valid case for that. Is all I'm saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know what? That's a very good point. So when I talk about consciousness being fundamental or emergent, to me that seems like a valid dichotomy. However, consciousness being fundamental does not necessarily dictate idealism. We could have all sorts of flavors of panpsychism, right?
Right.
So
yeah.
that's where I would accept that we don't have a dichotomy. It's not materialism or idealism and nothing else. We've got other options to explore in the middle.
There's even
I
weird
also
stuff
realize
like
that
these like monists and stuff like this who think that somehow consciousness and matter are like the same thing, or I don't know, it seems like an incoherent position to me. But yeah, so there's a bunch of weird positions on this thing. So when I put out this case for emergentism, I start with consciousness as the epistemic primary. And maybe that's a good place for us to plant a flag, right? Maybe we would both agree that the first thing that we can know is our own consciousness, that we're having an experience. That's probably, that's like the ground of epistemology. Like that's the first thing that we can know.
Yeah.
So then I would want to conquer these problems of like trying to figure other stuff out, right? So the next thing that I would want to grapple with would be this problem of other minds. And the way that I would say that I think that there are other minds is because I didn't come up with language, and that there are cultures and stuff that I don't know. I don't feel like I'm just remembering this stuff and it's technically all in my mind or something. No, I had to learn stuff that I didn't know. So to me, that's a good logical indicator, let's say, that there are other minds, other beings out there. I think we can start with the logical inference of other minds, and then we can come back later and we can prove it more with science. So I exist, other people exist, so we exist in a shared context of some kind. Now, from there, we're not saying that it's not idealism or that it's emergentism or that it's, realism.
We're being agnostic about it right now.
For
Shared
right
context,
now,
that's all we know.
We know that there's some shared context in which we exist.
Right.
And so from there, we try to figure out some things about that shared context. And we would start with some of these axioms or fundamental assumptions, like we exist in a shared reality that's consistent, that works in a particular way, right? And so this is like the origins of the foundations of how we do science.
Right.
I tested this thing, and I came to this conclusion. You look at it. You see if when you do it, you come to this conclusion. And if anybody who does this test can come to the same conclusion, that says something about the nature of reality and how it works.
Yeah.
Like the fact that we've gotten to this place where we can consistently and reliably build computers and cell phones and put a man on the moon, that says something about the nature of reality, how it works, and our mastery over being able to understand how it's going to work consistently.
Yes, I completely agree with you there. Yeah.
Okay, so these are these are the building blocks, right? Then I would say, now that we've established science has its best theories and its best explanations of events. So you get not just facts, but explanatory power around those facts. And a community of the adequate who will begin to interpret those facts in relation to each other. And there's this open, transparent process, which, I mean, of course, is not perfect by any means. There's not enough peer review around a lot of stuff, and we definitely have issues. But the idea being, given a long enough time scale, given this kind of process, we'll be able to refine and come in at something reliable, especially over time. So then I would argue that evolution is a fact, or like a valid theory that scientists are saying is a fact. Evolution is one of these well-established scientific theories. I think that scientists have done extra work to get out there in reaction to religious fundamentalist creationists getting out in like one equal emphasis in the textbooks in schools and stuff like this. They've been getting out there and being like, no, evolution is a fact. Like, you don't have a fact, you have an assertion. We will not be teaching this in science class, right? And I think we would see something similar about emergentism if scientists felt threatened by Buddhist fundamentalists who wanted equal representation in textbooks. We would see scientists getting out and being like, no, emergentism is the other side of the coin of evolution, which is a fact. And yeah, no, we are not going to be teaching creationism in science class. But one of the main problems with people who, when they talk about the hard problem, is in integral language, they act as if only the upper quadrants are factors at play, and as if we should be able to explain consciousness by talking about stuff. I think that's not a good case, and we can get into that more deeper.
Everything that we have in terms of forces can usually be boiled down to something that's fundamental. We don't have electromagnetism kicking in, say, 1 billion years into the universe. Neither would we do that with gravity or the weak force or the strong force. So my simple way of looking at it is saying, well, why would we say that about the effect that consciousness has on reality?
I guess my counter argument to that would be something like, look at the internet. Do we think that every microchip has a little bit of the internet in it, going all the way down and back? It's clearly a force. It's clearly a thing that's happening in reality that is real and is having a strong effect. But we don't think that it goes all the way down and back. We think that it's an emergent property of the hardware and the software. And from the perspective of, in this video right now, I'm not really even conscious of the fact that there's all of this like ones and zeros and hardware and all this kind of crazy stuff going on.
Right.
Like we start from that epistemic primary. We know that there's consciousness. We know that we exist, right? But I think that, again, if you want to make ontological or cosmological claims, or if we want to know what our consciousness really is, that we have to like figure that out in a context. And I feel like what I see a lot of idealists doing is being like, I know that consciousness is the epistemic primary, and I don't know that there can be other things outside of that, so therefore it must be the ontological primary. And to me, that seems like a leap in logic, where you didn't establish that it was the ontological primary. You just said, well, we can't know other things. And so then you think that you know something about consciousness without actually having demonstrated that you do know something about consciousness, right? So it's like, if I'm in this problem, I can't just assume that I even know what consciousness is until we've like done work through establishing other minds and through science and through figuring things out in a context. And if idealists are saying that this exterior context that we're experiencing isn't even the outside stuff, then I don't even think that they can epistemically, like in terms of logical moves, go from that to then making claims about the nature of reality. It seems to me, based on the type of moves that they're making, that they should be probably a solipsist and maybe an agnostic. There's missing logical steps that I haven't seen idealists make to come to their conclusion. In fact, I would say even further that I've never seen a valid logical case for idealism that I think stands. Like not even like getting to the like, oh, it's a valid idea, let's try to test it and falsify it. Like I haven't even seen idealists ever make a valid logical case that stands for idealism.
You can't reduce that, it feels like something to me, utterance down into that physical model. So we wouldn't be talking about weak emergence like the internet, we'd be talking about strong emergence, or as Ian McGilchrist says, brute emergence. We've gone from explaining stuff from its component parts to bang, something new just came onto the universe, right? It's that whole idea in the integral theory that there's not this interior quadrant until we get to a certain point in the universe, and then it pops up, and then it starts messing around with the rest of the rest of the quadrants, right? It starts interacting. So this idea that we've got this new thing that kicks in several billion years into the universe and then starts interacting with stuff is something that I find an intractable problem.
Yeah, there is kind of a problem with that, because I don't think that it's just like there's a switch and bang, it turns on, right? And I think that's one of my problems with the idea of the hard problem, is as if there should be just a time when it turns on. It's like there's no clear line between chemistry and biology. There's not like the switch where we can just be like, oh, that's when biology happened. And the difference between like the emergence of life, let's say, like biology. I watched this really good TED Talk once, The Blurry Line Between Life and Not Life, I think is what it's called. And like he's doing all these experiments with what he's calling protocells to see if he can figure out how to get life to emerge. It's really interesting. Basically, he starts with like these very, very simple little chemicals, and you put them in these little test tubes. They have like a property, like this one moves around. And then what happens is you get them in there and then they merge, and then a unique property will happen. Now this thing that just like would shake until the energy ran out, or like that would go to this, now it does this new property. And so it's like when life happens, 2 or 3 of these properties come together, and then we say, oh, now this is like the arbitrary line where we're saying something is alive. At least based on just looking at stuff. It's hard to say when something like an experience of beings, what it's like to be something, would come online. It seems like you would need some conceptual tools to be able to conceive of something like that, like not just the equipment to receive information from the environment, but some kind of conceptual processing of that information, like, oh, this is happening to me, and there are things out there. That in itself requires some conceptual elements, So it's like maybe something like an ant. So they're obviously communicating with other ants. They have some simple things like they're laying down trails of information, and they have like their simple roles and stuff like this. So it's not to say that there's not probably some kind of communication, or maybe even like a basic experience of what it might be like to be an ant, even if it's not fully conscious of it. I guess my point is, like, there's a very long spectrum of the development of consciousness from basically nothing up to something like us that's able to have a complicated experience. And it seems like we understand, we have data about lots of stuff in there. There are probably gaps in our knowledge, there are things that we don't know about or whatever. But this hard problem, like the way that it's framed, is as if we know nothing. because we can't point to like an on switch or something like that. And that seems to
Right.
be misrepresenting what's even being talked about in the first place, as if there is an on switch.
If we move to more of a dimmer switch model, I don't think that necessarily solves the problem. If we imagine a light bulb and we've got 0 volts, absolutely nothing is going on, we're not getting any photons coming off that filament whatsoever, the universe doesn't have subjective experience, and then it does. What I do really, really agree with you on, though, is that we've gone from very, very simple, rudimentary conscious experiences in terms of bacteria or however low you're comfortable going, right? And then working that through into much richer, more complicated conscious experiences that we have now. And I think that's possibly where the confusion lies. It's between this idea that what does a conscious state feel like for an animal or a plant or a bacteria or whatever you want to go with, and the fact that there's one to be had or there isn't. And I think that there's one to be had or there isn't, which is where we get that problem binary starting to come in.
Right. Well, I think also part of the problem is that we kind of start from pre-assumed ideas of what we think consciousness means in the first place when we have this conversation. Even when we're saying like, well, when does the consciousness happen? If we agree upon the definition of consciousness as something like what it feels like to be me or to have an experience or something like that, that's kind of a first-person description of consciousness that we could probably agree on. But that's not necessarily a third-person description of consciousness that we would agree on. And
Right.
and also, if we're talking about this dimmer switch idea, and if we're related back to this idea of what we were talking about earlier about philosophy and living a conscious life versus just post hoc justifications, one almost wonders if for most people the lights are even on yet.
Okay.
Even that, the idea of like, are these people conscious or are they just the universe playing itself out in some kind of way? Well, it depends on where you draw the line, I guess. Just starting from the bottom, in terms of biopsychism, we would make distinctions like sentient and then sapient and then an enlightened being or an awakened person. There's different ideas of what it even means to be awake and to be conscious, right? So it's like maybe we would want to say that cells have consciousness or plants have consciousness or something, but that's totally different from the kind of philosophically aware and actively conscious kind of thing that we're talking about on this different level. So
I should think so.
yeah. So even when we talk about what it is to be conscious, it can be confusing because there's so many different terms and so many different places where people draw the line. Yeah.
Yep, you're right. And I really do appreciate you bringing that up. The way that I always process this is very much through the lens of, does it feel like something to be And it's not just that. That sort of bootstraps you up to the next level, which is, does that feeling of being like something to be a thing then start affecting the environment? Right? So obviously with sort of human form, it certainly is. But the idea that consciousness has a force that acts on the world only when it gets to a certain complexity, sort of a threshold model. It's not my first go-to. My first go-to would be to assume that consciousness is always affecting the world, but meta-consciousness is more of a threshold thing. But, oh gosh, it's not easy territory, is it?
No, it's really not. These are complicated conversations. Even what we think consciousness is kind of an illusion. Or at least it's an illusion if we think about it in terms of the way that we've been indoctrinated to think about what it is to be a person or a self, right? So we have to rethink what consciousness even really is, that we kind of take it for granted and just think, oh, well, I'm just this thing. It's like in the same way that we take language for granted. I think that it's just describing what is. Right? And some of the components are not just reducible to hardware too. There's like software components too, or like conceptual components, especially to create something like consciousness, right? Because if you're going to have an experience of something out there, like you have to be able to interpret that and say that it's and feel like it's happening to you. So it's not just like it's just a matter of stuff. There's also a relational and meaning interpretive component to it. And so like I think that's part of the problem is like when people talk about it like this, they talk about like it should be reducible to stuff, and it's like it's not, because we're leaving out this whole conceptual interpretive framework which actually allows for the experience too.
And this is how I see the hard problem, right? It's when do you go from a system that's just behaving to a system that's also feeling?
You wonder at what point at which something actually feels and has an experience. Like there gets to be like, where is that line, and like what actually is required for it?
Well, it seems so unlikely to me that there is a line, because the line seems to be flying against everything that we know in physics, that I go, well, stop the line, let's get rid of the line. And that breaks into consciousness or some aspect of feeling being fundamental. So it's kind of funny, because I watched sort of the Ken Wilber stuff, and I was kind of resonating with that sense of that I amness, right? And it sort of, it goes in that direction. And, I've said before, and I think it is really important, I am quite partial to, I do quite prefer idealism, but I really want to make sure that I steel man and take really seriously all the other possibilities. I really want to think about them.
I respect that, man. I definitely can tell that you're honest and that you're acting in good faith here, and that you really you care about what's true and you want to figure out what's going on. There's no problem. Like, I mean, like when I first came across Ken Wilber, I would say that I was probably swinging more to the idealist side too. You know, I'd taken psychedelics, and I feel like, my concept of what reality was had been kind of blown open, and there's a lot of confusing language around the stuff too, and a lot of the way that people talk about stuff could actually be cashed out in the light of multiple different worldviews. Like people talk about like being a drop in the ocean. There's a lot of vague poetry going on out there, and it's not really clear how a lot of it cashes out. And there's, I think, in general, just a lot of confusion around, like in the postmodern community, about what cosmology is, what ontology is, what epistemology is. People a lot of times don't have these tools, and they don't know how to have these conversations, and they haven't really sat down and thought about it rigorously. And so I appreciate the effort and the hard work that you're putting in here to really try to figure out what's going on. I think, you're going above and beyond, especially compared to what most people do. And so big respect to you for that, man. At the end of the day, I think that we have to really look for that, and like at least give people the base level of respect for that approach, regardless of whether they're right or wrong, or we agree with them or not about certain things. What matters is if we're trying to figure it out in an honest and open kind of way. Because there's a lot of people out here who are talking about this stuff, and they are not talking about it in an honest or open kind of way where it seems like they're really trying to figure it out. And so that's a big thing to me. Like, I really respect and appreciate people who you can tell that they just want to know, like they just care, they just want to be in line with truth. And so that's what's up. I think that's, to me, like, that's a real philosopher right there. So big respect. Now, that being said, you're wrong. No.
That's better.
A lot of the stuff is confusing too, because like a lot of it is descriptions at like almost different fractal scales of reality, right? And it's like we want to be able to talk about how reality on a large scale is working, but also talk about how it's working on our level, and like also at this like tiny biological, like chemical kind of level. And it's like we have different ways of describing things at all of those levels, and they're not necessarily compatible with each other. Like it makes sense on one hand to talk about what the universe is doing and how it might be doing that through me and how I'm a part of that process. But then, on a very like everyday kind of practical scale, it's like, well, I chose to do this because I wanted to. So even just the language around a lot of this stuff makes it really, really hard for us to be able to establish anything, because it's also convoluted and confusing, and we don't really always have all the categories at play to be able to talk about what's happening at all these levels in relation to each other at once. It's fucking complicated stuff.
So where do you think I'm making a mistake in my thinking in what I've sort of explained so far about, well, the line doesn't make sense, so why have a line?
We can pretty clearly correlate functions to equipment, and we can say that certain things allow for other things to happen, right? In the same way, like, and I think this is true too, even if we have gaps in our knowledge, right? Like, I don't have to know everything about how a computer works to know that you can't pull up Facebook on the air. You need to have some kind of device that allows for Facebook to be displayed, or what, for it to work or something like that, right?
Sure.
So it seems to me like pretty clear when we look at like the really simple things or something like this, that they don't seem to have an experience, and they don't seem to have the equipment that would allow for such an experience. And it seems to me also that as we look at things becoming more complicated, that we can see that with the development of particular equipment, certain functions become possible. For example, the different levels of the brain allow for particular functions that correlate with those levels of the brain. And if you take those things away, you don't get those things. So for something like the experience of what it is to be me, to even be a possible thing, not only do you need to have the equipment to be able to process that kind of concept, but you have to have concepts to be able to put that together to be able to have that experience.
Well, you have to have concepts to relate it to someone else, for sure. I mean, you have to have concepts to understand it in a self-reflective way too. But I think that it would be possible to just have a raw being without there being a particular
I mean, I think you could have a raw experience, but like you're not going to be able to interpret or make any sense of it.
Right.
I like this rapper. His name is KRS-One, stands for Knowledge Reigns Supreme Over Nearly Everyone. He's a philosophy rapper. He says, you don't see with your eyes, you see with your brain. I'm going to say mind. I'm going to correct him. You see with your mind.
Right.
And the more ideas and concepts that you have, the more you can see, right? And so he says, if you come into a room, for example, and you're an electrician, you're going to see more things in that room than a regular person would, because you are trained to see particular things, right? So it's like, if you have more ideas, that allows for you to interpret reality. In this debate that I recently had with these two integral professors, one of them was talking about his experience of like sitting in front of the ocean and how he can't communicate everything that he's experiencing because it's such a profound experience. And I'm like, okay, maybe you can't communicate it, but there's also tons of things that you're not seeing because you're not a surfer, a historian, or you're not so you don't know actually everything that you're looking at. Your experience is limited to your own limited perspective. And I think that it's like that all the way down and back up to the point to where you don't even have the equipment to be able to necessarily process that stuff. Like I think a little cell or something like this, they don't have a concept of self. They don't probably have a concept of what it's like to be them. It's hard for me to say what a cell's experience would be like, and it's hard not to get into anthropomorphism or something like that on the other side too, right? Where it's like I start assuming that my experience is the same as a cell, but it doesn't seem like less complicated things are alive or have consciousness, and it certainly seems like it's equipment and hardware and software, if you don't mind me using those metaphors, that really allow for this thing to be possible. I don't really see you saying how or why you would think that it would go all the way down, or like what would be evidence that it exists at these lower levels. Just looking at the deductive reasoning of it, even if we can't know what the experiences of cells or these lower level things are like, it would certainly seem like that at a certain point things are not alive and they're not conscious, and there's not a good reason to think that they are, right?
Well, yeah. Well, I think we've got a real problem here, and I think you've really hit a nail on the head here, like majorly. When you say, when do things seem conscious? That's brilliant. I think that, look, honestly, what I'd really love to do with this, right? Because you know what, I'm a slow thinker, right? I don't have like quick genius moments or anything like that. What I do is I go and I process and I chew stuff over, and maybe 2 weeks later I'm like, ah, I've got something. So, I also want to totally agree with you on something as well, which is that it's not just you trying to figure something out against the world. It's you trying to cooperate with the world to figure stuff out. It's brilliant. Do you know what I mean? I know that you hit upon that sentiment before, and I just want to say, yes, absolutely. So I think the fault line, right, in our perspectives, the fault line is, when do things seem conscious? And that's brilliant.
So like a table or a cup has a mind?
It would have in some fashion, but we don't have to say that table, it has an individual mind, right? In the same way that a neuron in your brain that made up your conscious experience, it doesn't have to have a mind in of itself behind it, right? So we're just taking the idea that everything is made of mind, as your classical idealist thing goes, and that perhaps there's a mind behind the whole of the cosmos from which life is a dissociated mind, right? So when I look at the table, it's part of there's a mind behind it, but not behind the individual table, behind the whole of the physical, the world that the table is constituted of.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a major area of disagreement. In terms of epistemology, we would want to look in the correct quadrant for data. This is part of how integral theory works. The best kind of data that we could get is one relevant to the quadrant that we're looking in. So for example, if I want to know what's going on with you, if I want to know what your feelings are, the best way I could know that is just to ask you and for you to tell me and for you to give me your phenomenological report. Right. But there are other ways that I could know. If I have some knowledge about correlation between different feelings and different, let's say, behaviors and body language and things like that, then I can do cross-quadrant validation, let's say. This is probably something a lot of guys need to do. If their lady's like, I'm fine.
Cross-quadrant validation.
We need to work on this cross-quadrant validation. Okay, she says she's fine. She doesn't seem fine, though. So it's like, even if we can't get at the first person data of what it feels like to be these lower level things, we can do some cross quadrant validation, and we can be like, well, it doesn't seem like that they're able to do any of this stuff. It seems like now that they have this equipment, that now they're able to do this and this and this, or we see now that like this allows for this. And so I think that even though we can't know for sure, that we can do some pretty good deductive reasoning on this thing and come to some conclusions. And I'm sure that you would probably agree with a lot of those conclusions too, about like what kind of hardware allows for like what kind of capacities and stuff like that. I guess I would wonder if we could we ran it down and back, like, and I got you to agree, okay, well, it seems like this allows for this and this allows for this and this will like at what point, and then I could be like, okay, like here's a cell, okay, here's just some stuff and it doesn't seem to be doing anything. Why would we think that this has consciousness? Something like this. Like I feel like if I was good enough at doing this, I could get you to agree with the logic of a lot of this. I would be interested. Yeah,
I'm sure there's a lot of places where you could. No, really.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know where we really disagree around that. You know what I mean? Like at what point are we going to say no? That I think that even though this thing isn't acting as though it has consciousness, that maybe it still does, and why?
happy to be challenged. And I'll tell you what, this has been the best, most productive conversation I've had with someone who's disagreed with me since I've started my YouTube channel. I can't thank you enough for that.
Well, big respect, man. I appreciate you saying that.
Thanks for watching. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Support me on Patreon if you want to support more videos like this. And I'll see you next time. Peace.